We are flipping the pyramid. Flipping the pyramid.
Coming up on this week's WideShut webcast, Omar Bakri. He's known as one of Britain's most notorious Muslim hate preachers, and although the general public reject his extremist views, his relationship with the government has benefited foreign policy goals since the 90s. Today, that relationship is re-strengthened as Bakri reveals he's once again training UK citizens at terror camps, this time to join the Syrian rebels in overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. The West's dirty collusion with Muslim terrorists continues. Nigel Farage's UK Independence Party may push all the right buttons for exiting the EU superstate, but what do the party really represent on domestic issues? Troops on the streets? The death penalty? Increased spending for war? And an unrivaled passion for the Queen? Should the counterculture embrace this rising alternative, or do they need to be nipped in the bud before they gain any real power? All this and more on tonight's show.
And now, live from England, bringing you news and analysis that you won't find on the corporate and government mainstream media. It's the WideShut Webcast.
Good evening everyone, welcome along to the WideShut Webcast. I'm Keelan Balderson. And there's a lot of important things going on in the UK and the rest of the world this week. Former intelligence asset Omar Bakri is back doing MI6 and the CIA's dirty work, training the Syrian rebels, some of them even UK citizens. We'll be getting into that. Also, with UKIP hitting the headlines over the last couple of weeks for various scandals and a lot of hype about Europe, I think it's time we really investigate what Nigel Farage and his crew actually believe in. Folks, just because he's been on the Alex Jones show doesn't mean he's the answer to all the world's problems. If you're new to the WideShut webcast, we first air on Sundays at 8 PM UK time on flippingthepyramid.co.uk, and then shortly after you can get the archive on my website wideshut.co.uk. You can get the MP3, iTunes, a YouTube version, and even on your mobile phone with the Stitcher application.
In the days and weeks since the 7th of July, many have raised concerns about extremists.
The government briefed that it was considering whether to charge extremist clerics whose preaching might incite terrorism.
One man high on the government's list of those soon to be deported is almost certainly Omar Bakri Mohammed.
Islam the future for Britain. Islam will dominate the whole world. Remember, our campaign is continue. The struggle will continue until Islam will dominate the whole world.
Can I put to you the government's position? They accuse people like you of using the type of language and putting forward a world view which actually inflames the passions of people like Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, who all evidence that says did attend, and consequently you bear some responsibility for their actions.
This form of tahreed ala jihad, form of incite people to do jihad.
The radical Muslim cleric Omar Bakri Mohammed has been banned from setting foot on British soil again. He left Britain 6 days ago and has been staying in Lebanon with his mother. Today, the Home Office said his presence in Britain is not conducive to the public good.
It's a familiar image that's been painted before, and in some respects it's a fairly accurate one. Omar Bakri, the radical Islamic preacher, was at the forefront, along with Abu Hamza and a few others, the forefront of the rise of the more extreme elements of Islam in Britain through the 90s. Some of the alleged 7/7 bombers did attend his sermons. He did say a lot of inflammatory things. He did call for holy war in Britain and for Sharia to take over Britain. And he's shown support for Al-Qaeda and terrorists overseas. So following 7/7, there was a massive uproar about the fact that people like Bakri, with these incompatible views to British life and democracy, there was an uproar that they were allowed a platform to preach and recruit and to even train British-based Muslims for jihad and for terrorism overseas and so on. Something had to be done about the extremists, and Omar Bakri was eventually banned from Britain in 2005. He scarpered to Lebanon, and now the government refused to let him back into the UK. We know that story. We've seen that image presented many, many times. But the problem with that image, he's an evil extremist preacher, this is our country, send him back to terrorist land. The problem with that is that it lacks a certain context. People forget that we allowed Bakri the platform to preach hate. The government were happy for him to talk about Islam taking over the world. The government were happy for him to send young men to Pakistan to train for jihad. People have to ask themselves, why? Now, most people assume that Bakri was allowed to operate in Britain because we have free speech, because we're a democracy, because we're tolerant, because there's nothing we could really pin on him. We didn't have the terror legislation properly yet. There's a sense that we were too good for our own good. The liberal do-gooders who wanted to hold hands with everybody. It was them that prevented us from getting rid of these extremist preachers. And everything is shades of grey. I'm not denying that that was one of the reasons that Bakri was kept around for so long. But there are many layers to this story. And I think we have to look at the bigger picture. Other than upholding the wonderful values of democracy, what else might the government have gained from leaving Bakri and Abu Hamza and other people like that alone? Did they benefit in any way from having this element of extremism in Britain? You look at documentaries like The Power of Nightmares by Adam Curtis that lay out this idea that governments need these polarizing figures like Omar Bakri in order to rally the nation and unify the public for their various agendas. Politics itself is a game of tennis. You set two poles, each side, left and right, and you bat the ball back and forth, a big show to the public, while both sides control them. Without Labour playing the phony left side of the game, and without Conservatives playing the phony right side of the game, I guess you could say, then there's nobody to argue back and forth. Then there's no politics. How do you put on the show without the puppets? And I think Bakri, at least at one stage, was a puppet within the UK political spectrum. Somebody they left alone because he could serve other purposes. So when we look at Bakri, we have to remember that there is a bigger picture, a wider context that he fits within. September 11th, 2001 was the beginning of a contrived war on terror, a fake war on terror. There never was and still isn't any solid evidence for the official story or anything to prove that bin Laden was behind 9/11. And despite the alleged hijackers being Saudi, despite them getting their visas to America fast-tracked at a CIA consulate in Saudi Arabia, despite being flanked by Mossad while in America. After the attacks, with no evidence whatsoever, the US and the UK and others began a pre-planned invasion of Afghanistan. We don't need to go over all that again, we've done it many times on the show, but elements of the US government, the neocons, wanted 9/11 to take place. They wanted the quote, new Pearl Harbor in order to justify a military empire across the Middle East. So in a sense, going back to the Adam Curtis concept, the Muslim terrorists, rather than being the true enemy of the US and the UK, in many ways were integral to the agenda. They were pawns, and depending on how you weigh up various bits of evidence, 9/11 was either allowed to happen, i.e. they got wind of something going down and they looked the other way and perhaps moved a few set pieces around to allow the attack to take place unhindered, or there was a more hands-on pulling of the strings, more of a complete false flag operation. It's shades of grey, but either way it boils down to the same thing. It was contrived to create a pretext for the expansion of the empire. And this element of extremism was needed by those behind the agenda, rather than being a legitimate enemy. Without them, the agenda couldn't go ahead, so they're actually their friends. The Muslims have always been a pawn in this game. They've always been integral to the imperialist agendas of the West. Whether they're on the side of the imperialists or whether they're propped up as the enemy of the imperialists, like the war on terror. Without them, the current Anglo-American Israeli power structure would not exist. By now we all know the story that the CIA used the Mujahideen, worked alongside bin Laden during the Soviet-Afghan war of the 80s. Camps were set up, they were trained and armed and guided by the CIA to stop the Soviets from gaining influence in the region. A few years down the line, they flip it, and the very people they supported were now the enemy after the contrived attacks of 9/11. This time, it was to justify the expansion of the West's influence in the Middle East as a whole. The Soviets were out, now it was time to go to the next step and dominate the Muslims themselves. It's all the same game of power. So if we go back to Bakri, on the face of it, it would appear that he is an enemy of the West. He preached hate, he recruited would-be terrorists and so on. You'd think that we would hate him. But in actuality, rather than being an enemy, he was a prop that enabled an imperialist agenda to go ahead. In more recent times, he's been used as a talking head, a boogeyman that could play into the war on terror propaganda. Look, the terrorists are after us. This preacher is one of them. He's recruiting people here in Britain. He won't condemn bin Laden. He's radicalizing people. And he was used as one of those faces of fear, a face to justify the agenda. Look, this is real. Here's a beardy guy. This is why we're in Afghanistan. This is why we're in Iraq. These are evil people. Here's one of them. But also, in the years before 9/11, before that role that Muslims played in the narrative, before that role was flipped to being the enemy, Bakri was very much an ally of the British government. Like I said, there are shades of grey. He was a legit hate preacher and was no doubt left untouched partly because we were just being a tolerant Western society. But at the same time, whether we were being tolerant or not, there's an extra layer to this. The government needed Bakri to be in the position that he was because he was helping with the proxy war against the Serbs in the Balkans. In the 90s, he was recruiting Muslims from the streets of Britain to fight alongside the likes of the Kosovo Liberation Army. So was there an extra benefit for turning a blind eye for so many years to his preaching? Well, yeah, because it supported Blair's foreign policy.
And you're really quite...
with his uncle in Pakistan.
Sorry to interrupt you. You're quite fiery lessons. I mean, you know, we've seen the videos of your worldview and of how you preach, and of course you're entitled to your view about the world.
Of course, you know,
can I just put to you the government's position? They accuse of people like you of using the type of language and putting forward a worldview which actually inflames the passions of people like Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, who all evidence says did attend, and consequently you bear some responsibility for their actions.
I think we should persecute the British government because they left me said all this for 20 years, you know. I'm not a person who was speaking something in hiding. I always, you know, distribute my leaflet, my talks, my circle.
Do you bear any responsibility for indoctrinating people involved in the 7-7? Do you bear any responsibility for inflaming passions, or do you think everything you've said has been entirely for people's peaceful purposes, for example, saying that the 7-7 bombers were in paradise now?
You see, the question of Muslims will go to paradise, you know, and will be account for his bad deed. This is matter of religious, you see, theological studies. I don't think it is good for you and me to sit down here and discuss about what the destiny of the people who die in 9/11 or die, you see, really in London bombing. I think the best thing to say it, I never ever incite people to carry any action against anybody, because I always believe Muslims who are living in Britain, living under covenant of security, not allowed for them to attack anybody.
So there you have it. Sky News, an interview with Bakri, saying the government left him alone for 20 years. He operated under the covenant of security, where the government allowed the extreme Islam movement to flourish as long as they never targeted the UK itself. Now, you could argue that from the beginning the likes of Bakri were preaching hate towards Britain, but regardless, the point is the government left him alone. Why are you attacking me? They allowed me to preach hate for 20 years. I never directly called for terror attacks. I was working under the covenant of security. In an interview in the year 2000, he says, "The British government knows who we are. MI5 has interrogated us many times. I think now we have something called public immunity." Our government was protecting this guy. It's not as simple as, oh, we were just being tolerant. There was an unwritten deal between them. I used to encourage people to go to Bosnia to help their Muslim brothers and sisters when the UK law permitted that type of intervention. We used to help mostly in Bosnia and Kosovo as part of the broader humanitarian effort. When you remove the fuzzy language, what it boils down to is that Bakri was helping NATO's dirty war in the Balkans, which was basically a war between the Serbians and the Muslim Albanians. Bakri and others funded and provided jihadis to fight that cause. The proxy army was the Kosovo Liberation Army, and NATO was bombing from the air. It was basically a repeat of the Mujahideen Soviet-Afghan war, where the West backed the fundamentalist extremists to fight the Soviets, as we've talked about. It's the same as what recently happened in Libya, where NATO and the West backed the Islamic extremists on the ground to take out Gaddafi, and some British people were involved in that. There's a Sky News interview of a British guy that went to Libya to fight that dirty war. The same thing happened in the 90s in the Balkans. This was Blair's other illegal war that people forget about. Ironically, he was on the side of the Muslims that time, and Bakri was one of the figures that was involved in this. That's why, or at least that's one of the reasons why, he was left untouchable for so long. He had public immunity. He was part of this network, this covert, dirty operation that was utilising the extremist groups to fight Slobodan Milosevic. Another quote from the year 2000. "We are continuing to support the fighters in Kosovo. We are raising funds for them and our comrades who are struggling against oppression in Albania. We are doing it because we believe the KLA should rearm." That was a quote from Bakri. And through these Islamic networks that were tolerated by the government, thousands of British Muslims went and received terror training through groups like Bakri's Al-Muhajirun. Former Metropolitan Police Chief Lord Stevens has suggested 3,000 British-born or British-based people have passed through Al-Qaeda training camps. That was BBC News. More specifically, MP Michael Meacher pointed out about 200 Pakistani Muslims living in the UK went to Pakistan, trained in HUA camps, and joined the HUA's contingent in Bosnia. Most significantly, this was with full knowledge and complicity of the British and American intelligence agencies. A Guardian headline from that time: "The CIA has been allowed to run riot in Kosovo with a private army designed to overthrow Slobodan Milosevic. Now he's gone, the US State Department seems incapable of reining in its bastard army." And this was allowed because at that time it was congruent with Blair's foreign policy. We're supporting the Muslims today. Our agenda says they can benefit us today. Tomorrow we're going to be fighting the Muslims. We don't care. We just want more power. See, they didn't care that Bakri had once called for the assassination of John Major, or that his group Al-Muhajirun had been linked to terror attacks overseas, or that Bakri was in fact calling for holy war and Sharia in Britain, which breaks the Covenant of Security itself. It didn't matter to them, because they were just pawns. It wasn't a real deal. It was all just manipulation. At that moment in time, they were using Bakri and others so Blair could stroke his ego in the Balkans and bomb them into a refugee crisis. And later on, Blair would throw the Muslims under the bus, the extremists under the bus, and would start a war on terror. Whatever the flavour of the month is, whatever suits them at that time. And if you watch my film 7/7 What Did They Know, and also if you can stomach the older one, 7/7 The Big Picture, I go into this in more detail, but I brought all this up again today. I know we've been over it time and time again, and it can become like a stuck record, but I brought up this history again today because Omar Bakri is pretty much doing the exact same thing right now in Lebanon. He's training Muslims, some British, to become the Syrian rebels that are trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. He may be banned from Britain, but he's still supporting their foreign policy goals and doing their dirty work. The West are supporting the extremists within the Syrian opposition to take out Assad, and our old friend Omar Bakri is wrapped up in all that. Muslim cleric banned from Britain claims Al-Qaeda poised to launch suicide attacks in Syria. Omar Bakri Mohammed, the radical cleric banned from the United Kingdom for glorifying terrorism, has told the Daily Telegraph from his base in the Middle East that Al-Qaeda is poised to wage war against the Syrian regime. Bakri, once nicknamed the Tottenham Ayatollah, said hardline Salafi Muslim groups, including Al-Qaeda and his own group, are ready to help their Muslim brothers with a campaign of suicide attacks against President Bashar al-Assad. And that was a report from January. And then recently, this past week, exiled hate preacher, I trained 4 Brits for jihad war. 4 British extremists are being trained to fight in Syria at a camp run by exiled Omar Bakri, the Sun can reveal. The hate preacher, who is banned from the UK, boasted of his military-style courses for Islamic fanatics on the lawless border with Lebanon. In a chilling interview, Bakri revealed one recruit was a computer programmer in his 20s from London, while another was a Midlands-based IT worker, and he claimed others like them will follow. He said of the 4, 2 of them have Syrian connections, but they are all born in the UK and have professional backgrounds. After their training, they will do their duty of jihad, holy war in Syria. So, once again, the British establishment find themselves on the side of Al-Qaeda and Islamic extremists. And our old friend Bakri is once again training Brits for a covert proxy war backed by the West. You know, I think back to Assad's interview with Barbara Walters, where he talked about how it was outside forces and terrorists causing the problems in Syria. Well, the evidence for that just keeps mounting up.
Traveling across Syria, we met many young, fresh-faced men who have joined the rebellion. But there's a much more ominous presence now in Syria, too, that has many in Washington worried. Foreign fighters, mostly religious fundamentalists, streaming in and taking up the fight. They want Assad to go and Syria to become an Islamic state. We headed out to find some of them. Instead, led by that car right there, they found us. They were heavily armed, so we hid our camera. Well, that was interesting. We were stopped by a van full of what were clearly fundamentalist fighters. They stopped our car. They all had AK-47s. They wanted to see our passports and IDs. Clearly very unhappy to see us. What was quite interesting is they were speaking Arabic with a non-Syrian accent as well as other languages, so we got out of there really fast. Along with the arrival of foreign fighters is something even more worrying. The growing number of suicide bombings is evidence that Al-Qaeda is here as well. Their infamous black flags in a growing number of videos coming out of Syria.
From northern Lebanon, we watch Syrian army soldiers on the other side of the border. They're trying to stop the smuggling into Syria of weapons and fighters. Even the Lebanese government is now claiming that among those who've crossed illegally are members of Islamist groups, including Al-Qaeda. The Syrian regime claims this man is the leader of Al-Qaeda in Lebanon. Omar Bakri is a hardline cleric stripped of his UK citizenship.
Amid bloodshed in Syria, more extremists are penetrating the country to help bring down Assad. That's according to U.S. intelligence, which says Al-Qaeda-affiliated fighters were responsible for a series of deadly suicide bombings in Damascus and Aleppo, targeted at Syrian military and intelligence facilities. This, as Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri has called on his supporters around the world to back the uprising in Syria. These men, who call themselves the Mujahideen, say they're on their way to fight a holy war against Assad. In Washington, senators asked the head of America's intelligence, James Clapper, what happens if Assad falls.
Are we prepared for the situation of a possible failed state where Al-Qaeda enjoys a safe harbor and refuge and from which to coordinate attacks?
His response bears no optimism.
There would be kind of a vacuum, I think, that would lend itself to extremists operating in Syria, which is particularly troublesome.
Some ask a different question. Is the U.S. on the same side as Al-Qaeda in Syria, and whether its policies are indirectly aiding the terrorists?
American strategists would have to be fools not to see what Al-Qaeda is doing, not to ask the question, if it's good for Al-Qaeda, can it be good for us? And not to look at Assad and say, he may be a ruthless dictator in what he's doing, but what comes after him when he falls?
Well, the Anglo-American-Israeli pact get what they want. Extremists spilling over into Iran to cause more destabilization in Iran, which is their next target. And remember, the likes of Bakri don't actually like Iran. They're different versions of Islam. That's why it was absurd that the establishment were trying to say that Ahmadinejad was protecting bin Laden once, a few years ago. Well, no, because they're actually enemies. But, you know, they hope that the general viewer doesn't know these finer details. But again, we're seeing this merging of agendas between the West and the extremists. And I guess this also leaves that window open for the governments of Britain and America and so on to say, oops, Al-Qaeda are now in Syria, even though we helped put them there and our weapons that we're smuggling in have gotten into their hands and we know they're there because we back them. Well, we may have to go in and sort things out now because the terrorists are there. You know, it's a sick game of chess, and once again the extremists are the pawns in that game. And it's ironic, I don't know if anyone else caught this recently, but we've obviously had a whole series of war crimes trials for Serbian leaders. Milosevic famously died or was poisoned to death just before he could stand trial, because no doubt it would dig up too much dirt on this incredibly biased and dirty war led by NATO. But we've had Milan Babic, who also died in his cell, Radoslav Barajadin, who was sentenced, Radovan Karadzic, I think, which is ongoing. The list goes on and on and on. But when the NATO-backed Muslim extremist KLA commanders stand trial, well, they're acquitted, aren't they? And of course, NATO itself, who did most of the damage, caused the mass refugee crisis. I'm sure all of you will remember the charity ads on television and specials saying we must help the refugees from Kosovo, even though it was us that bombed them and made them leave. But Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and NATO, they're not standing trial at all, are they? It's not an international criminal court, it's a Western-controlled criminal court. The criminals they want to remain in power, stay in power. The criminals they want to send down for war crimes, they will, but they'll never go down for their own war crimes. It's completely corrupt. The former Prime Minister of Kosovo, Ramush Haradinaj, and 2 ex-commanders of the Kosovo Liberation Army have been cleared of war crimes charges for a second time at a tribunal in The Hague. We're going to go for a quick break now, folks, and when we return, what does Nigel Farage and UKIP actually stand for? Keep it locked here on the WideShut Webcast.
We are flipping the pyramid.
Flipping the pyramid.
Flipping the pyramid.
Flipping the pyramid.
Flip the pyramid.
Flipping the pyramid.
Flip the pyramid. We aim to see the world as it really is.
Turning that pyramid on its head.
www.flippingthepyramid.co.uk.
Flipping the pyramid. Flipping the pyramid.
Flippingthepyramid.co.uk.
Flipping the whole paradigm of that hierarchical system on its head.
You have the charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk. And the question that I want to ask, that we're all going to ask is, who are you? I'd never heard of you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard of you. I would like to ask you, President, who voted for you? And what mechanism Oh, I know democracy is not popular with you lot. And what mechanism do the peoples of Europe have to remove you? Is this European democracy? Well, I sense, though, that you're competent and capable and dangerous, and I have no doubt that it's your intention to be the quiet assassin of European democracy and of the European nation states. You appear to have a loathing for the very concept of the existence of nation states. Perhaps that's because you come from Belgium, which of course is pretty much a non-country. But since you took over, we've seen Greece reduced to nothing more than a protectorate. Sir, you have no legitimacy in this job at all, and I can say with confidence that I can speak on behalf of the majority of the British people in saying we don't know you, we don't want you, and the sooner you're put out to grass, the better.
Well, we've all heard the charismatic speeches of UKIP's Nigel Farage in the European Parliament. He's gained quite a following in the counterculture, the alternative media. He's been on the Alex Jones show a number of times, and he presses a lot of the right buttons. And folks, if you listen to my show, you'll know that I 100% agree with Farage on Europe, and I even voted UKIP at the last EU elections. They're really the closest chance of pulling out of this post-democratic superstate. But what worries me is that people are jumping on the UKIP bandwagon domestically without really looking at what they stand for. Europe is one thing, but domestically, are they really a party we want in power? Here's a story that broke last week.
Good evening, I'm Lucrezia Millarini. He is in the running to become a London MP in just a few days, but an aspiring politician has been condemned for having 19th century views on gay couples adopting. Winston McKenzie, who is the UKIP candidate in the Croydon North by-election, claims same-sex couples shouldn't be allowed to look after children, believing it's unhealthy. His comments have angered gay rights campaigners, as Nick Thatcher reports.
He's the former boxer whose campaign video is designed to show that as a politician, he doesn't always pull his punches.
My name is Winston McKenzie. We begin the fight for survival.
But his comments in a newspaper interview in which he likened adoption by same-sex couples to child abuse has sparked controversy. He told a reporter that to say to a child, "I am having you adopted by two men who kiss regularly, but don't worry about it, that is abuse. It is a violation of a child's human rights because that child has no opportunity to grow up under normal circumstances."
The word abuse is wrong. I put my hands up to that and I retract that.
Today, at his office in the Croydon North constituency, he told us he regretted using the word abuse, but said as a Christian, gay adoption was against his moral beliefs.
I'm sorry, it's wrong. It's against my Christian beliefs. It's a moral issue and cannot be tolerated. It has to stop in its tracks.
But his remarks have been condemned by one gay charity as views belonging in the past.
He's expressing 19th century views that have no place in 21st century London. We all know that the top priority in adoption cases is always the needs of the child, not some political obsessive extreme views.
Okay, so that's one UKIP MP's opinion, not necessarily the stance of the whole party. But it just doesn't strike me that this is a particularly progressive or enlightened political grouping. I don't really hear anything new or radical from them. They just come across as old-fashioned Tories, really. Kind of going for the traditional vote. The slightly less controversial nationalist vote. Is that the future of politics? MPs getting sidetracked over gay adoption and things like that? I'm not sure that people like this should really be adopted by this counterculture, this growing resistance, this newfound interest in truth and deep politics. I'm not sure that this is the party for us.
British Prime Minister David Cameron has called the riots pure criminality. Speaking after a meeting of the country's emergency committee, he promised that looters will face the full force of the law. Well, joining us live now is Gerard Batten, who's a member of the European Parliament. Thank you for joining us. Some 16,000 officers are expected tonight on the streets of London. Do you think that will be enough?
Well, I think that the police have been outnumbered so far. This is pure criminality. I agree with David Cameron on that. And I think that the point has come where we have to call in the armed forces.
Well, that was UKIP MP, or MEP in Europe, Gerard Batten, calling for martial law during the riots, agreeing with David Cameron that it was pure criminality. Troops on the streets, is that an agenda of somebody looking to bring change to the political spectrum? Is that a freedom fighter? Or is that a hard-nosed old Tory mentality? Does Gerard Batten care about the murder and cover-up of Mark Duggan? Does he care that the police pretty much instigated the riot after they attacked a young girl at a peaceful protest? Does he care that the thieving bankers and politicians using us as their credit card collateral have created an unequal society and are now pulling that rug from beneath the poorest people? Does he even realise that the reason the police seemed outnumbered was because they were told to stand down? They weren't actually outnumbered. The police could have clobbered them and stopped it easily, but they didn't. They just stood there and let it happen. This guy is ignorant and he does not represent me, and I'd hate to see somebody like him leading this country into the next era. Oh yeah, let's get the troops on the streets. What? Is this really the Freedom Party?
Well, a big hello to our friends in Australia. We're here outside Westminster Abbey. It's 24 hours to go before the royal wedding, and there are just the most incredible scenes in London that we've seen for decades. There is joy, there is happiness, but of course it's not just a British celebration. There are people here from all over the world, but most important, there are people here from the Commonwealth. And I've got Tom here. He's here from Melbourne. He's on holiday. He's having a great time. Say hello to the folks back at home, Tom.
Hi everyone in Australia.
Do you wish they could be here with you?
Oh, absolutely. It's amazing scenes. Came over here last night from Melbourne and wow, it's blowing my mind away.
Brilliant. You see, the English aren't as stuffy as some Australians think. And I'm also here with Jane, who lives in Sydney. Jane, what can you say about it here?
It's fantastic. It's jolly cold. it is jolly cold, but it's amazing. The atmosphere is fantastic. Everybody's just being funny and laughing and very, very happy. We're all excited to be together, sharing an historical event.
Yeah, it's a fantastic scene here. It's a great event. We're all celebrating the fact we have a monarchy rather than some banged out old politician as president. Let's keep the monarchy, let's keep the Commonwealth, and all of you back in Australia tomorrow, raise a glass and toast the happy couple.
Oh yeah, that's right. UKIP are royalists as well, celebrating the bloody empire of a bunch of inbred, self-appointed dictators. Farage likes to moan about the taxpayers being fleeced by Europe, but he's happy for us to be fleeced by the biggest benefit scroungers on the planet. As the people of Britain are forced onto austerity, the Queen still gets her 40 million allowance each year. The royal family still get their 100 million a year travel and housekeeping expenses. We paid 20 million for the royal wedding, ignoring the undisclosed secret amount we had to pay for the security at the royal wedding. And the national holiday of that day, because everyone got a day off work, cost the economy 5 billion. I don't hear Farage talking about any of that. And while he was acting like the PR department for the royals, me and fellow FTP host Red and Brit from Resist Radio, we were actually protesting the wedding and handing out flyers explaining that the royal family are the biggest benefit scroungers in the country. So again, I'm not sure that UKIP really represent the future of politics in this country. They're beginning to sound like a step backwards to me. And if you go to the UKIP.org website and actually look at their policies, there are some very worrying things on there that I think at least need a debate. There's a policy on there that they want to allow citizen arrests to be commonplace, vigilantes, goon squads. They want a, quote, easy system for people to effect citizens' arrests for vagrancy, drunkenness, vandalism, weapons, low-level disorder, thieving and shoplifting. Right, so what happens when some old guy tries to arrest a hoodie and gets knifed to death? What happens when somebody claims somebody was doing something but there's no evidence, but they citizen arrested them? I mean, how do they expect to implement such an idea? They're just playing to the stuffy old Tory crowd. They want tougher prison sentences. Life means life, in their opinion. I think that's debatable. The most worrying thing here on their manifesto that I think slipped under the radar is that they want a 40% increase in military spending, or quote, defence. It says it right here. They want 40% more than we're already spending on the military industrial complex. UKIP aren't anti-war by any stretch. I'm going to now go to a clip of one of our regular guests, Tom Secker, talking to James Corbett about this very topic back in June. This is interview 158, Political Philosophy with Tom Secker from CorbettReport.com. I would have got Tom on the show, but I didn't really plan this very well. It was a bit last minute, so I didn't really have time to actually arrange an interview with Tom. But here's a segment from the interview he did with James Corbett, which I think outlines some of the main issues with jumping on this UKIP bandwagon without actually analysing their policies.
So if we then look at slightly more fringe parties, and the one that sort of particularly irks me and bothers me is UKIP, the UK Independence Party, because there is a lot of promotion of, in particular, Nigel Farage in the independent media, and I'm not sort of trying to bitch anyone out here, but I've seen very little rounded appreciation or criticism of what UKIP actually stand for. In fact, most people, and again, I'm not sort of trying to single people out or name any names or anything like that, but most people that I've spoken to who are in the fringe politics, alternative media, truth movement, whatever, who I've talked to about UKIP, who kind of sing their praises, the vast majority of them don't even seem to have actually read the policies that are on UKIP's own website. They just seem to be going on this, Nigel Farage sticks it to the EU and therefore he must be a good man and his platform must be good and therefore he must be someone that we should support because he's a fringe politician, not a mainstream politician, and so let's put our money and our votes behind him. And I just think that's so... Firstly, it's quite ignorant. As I say, I think quite a lot of these people are quite ignorant of what UKIP's platform and policies really are. I also think it's so misguided that to expect that just because someone is opposed to one dimension of the problem, talking in big inverted commas there, I think it's so misguided to think that it's therefore he's someone we should be getting behind and his platform is something we should be getting behind. Because when you look at what UKIP actually say, I've made a few notes here on the back of a response to a Freedom of Information request from the FBI. They say they want to spend an extra 40% on the military. They want to raise the military budget in the UK by 40%. I don't think that's anything that most people in the truth movement or whatever could really get behind. They want to maintain the nuclear deterrent. They want to keep this completely pointless arsenal of massively expensive nuclear weapons that are... they're not just a moral abomination. Politically, they don't make any sense because we're never going to be in a position that we're ever going to use them. And supposedly, since the great threats are, rogue dictators and terrorists and climate change, well, nuclear weapons aren't an answer to any of those problems. You're never going to use a nuclear missile against a terrorist group, are you? So it just doesn't make any sense, even within the very limited framework of state politics, let alone is it something we could is this something we should value? Is this something that we should want and we should want to see out there in the world? I really don't think it is. They also say they want to strengthen our commitment, Britain's commitment to NATO. So he's anti-EU but pro-NATO. I mean, that's not something I feel that we should be supporting, or certainly not that I can support. As far as I'm concerned, if it was a choice between the EU and NATO, I'd be slightly more in favour of the EU than NATO. But of course, it isn't a choice between those two things. They're both just kind of different manifestations of the same movement to centralise power. And so therefore we should be opposed to both of them. So it's clear that Farage and UKIP aren't opposed to centralised power per se. They're in favour of centralised military power under NATO and opposed to centralised state bureaucratic power under the EU, which kind of, to me, it just seems like either a total confusion or a total hypocrisy. And then if we look at slightly more domestically, they want to scrap the Human Rights Act because, not that I'm even necessarily defending the Human Rights Act, but what does it tell you about a party when that is top of their agenda? And their excuse for scrapping the Human Rights Act, so it would make it easier to deport terrorism suspects. I mean, this is just the same old nonsense that we've had from mainstream parties, slightly rejigged and slightly kind of jazzed up and made to seem a bit more radical, and in order to try and win votes from disgruntled people. And people have every right to be disgruntled. I'm disgruntled, you're disgruntled, a hell of a lot of people around the world are. And that's all great, you know. Like it says in the film, you've got to get mad first, but then I think you need to kind of calm down a bit and think, what are we going to do about this? And I don't think the answer to the question, what are we going to do about this, is we should support Nigel Farage and UKIP. They want to double the amount of prison space in the UK. They want to introduce a life must mean life sentencing policy and a 3 strikes sentencing policy. So basically, they want to throw more people in prison for longer. They want to spend more on the military. They want to get more involved in NATO. And they want to scrap the Human Rights Act. Does this really sound like a party that an alternative politics, a fringe politics and a truth movement should be getting behind?
No, it certainly doesn't. You know, they might be right on Europe and they may be right on wind farms and climate change, but they have to draw support from somewhere, and it seems like those issues have clouded people from seeing the rest of their policies. We're going to take another quick break and then come back and wrap things up with the rest of the week's headlines.
Flipping the Pyramid is a group of individuals that have come together under a common cause: truth. We aim to discover the truth about our world and the issues it faces. Floating in a sea of misinformation, outright lies, blatant propaganda, and institutionalized indoctrination, we aim to see the world as it really is, not as we're told it is by our politicians, the corporate-controlled media, the agendized academia, or the failed dogma of religious prejudice. When we look into the future, we see the darkest events from our past revisiting us. We do not believe this is a result of a natural path for humanity. We believe there is an agenda at work. This is not to say we believe in conspiracy theories. We believe that to stand any chance of changing the pattern of war, death, starvation, and financial desperation, and of having a truly free and fair world for all, without exception, we must first understand what is really taking place, who is responsible, and what the desired outcomes are. Together, we are flipping the pyramid. www.flippingthepyramid.co.uk.
Welcome back to the WideShut Webcast. I'm your host, Keelan Balderson. And there are a couple of other headlines worth touching on this week. The Leveson inquiry into phone hacking, that whole scandal and all the criminal antics of the British press has finally finished. And the result is proposals for a new media regulatory body empowered through legislation. Leveson finds that the existing Press Complaints Commission is not sufficient and recommends a new independent body which would have a range of sanctions available to it, including fines and a direction of the prominence of apologies and corrections. Membership of the body would be voluntary, but incentivised by schemes such as a kite mark and an inquisitorial arbitration service for handling tort claims such as libel and breach of privacy, and by allowing exemplary damages to be awarded in cases brought against non-participants in the scheme, something not usually part of English law. Long story short, a new layer of media regulation is on the horizon. Personally, I would say punish those that break the law and leave everybody else alone. We don't need new legislation. Now, I don't think this will actually be a big deal. I think this is just being done so they're shown to be doing something. You know, it was a big public scandal. They want to say, look, this is what we've done. We've made these proposals. Everything's going to be all right. So I don't think free speech is actually on the line. It's not really a free speech issue that's the problem these days. It's more of a manipulation of what people see and hear. People can still say and do what they want for the most part, but it's the manipulation and propaganda of the media that makes it a problem. I think we should be hitting the media in the pocket, not through legislation and regulation. If you think they're doing immoral things, if you don't like the intrusive celebrity culture and all those other things, then buy a different newspaper. Go to different sources. Go to sources that you do trust. Go to the alternative media. The only way this kind of press continues is because people are reading it. And on the phone hacking and stuff itself, well, there's no need for extra legislation. That's illegal. So, to me, this just seems like a big show to say, look, we've done something, now can we all move on? I don't know if anyone noticed, but the McCanns were given a platform during the press coverage of the Leveson report. They've almost become like a lobby group these days. They've had the fingers in the press for a long time, manipulating it. I guess they're still ticked off because the press told the truth, that they were official suspects, and some of the leading investigators in Portugal believe they killed their daughter. But that's another topic for another day. It just seems odd to me, the amount of power and coverage these McCanns get. But yeah, something to keep an eye on. Is it the end of the free press? No, I don't think so. But I think it should be a wake-up call to people that the mainstream media aren't doing their job. Don't try and force them to do their job or add new levels of bureaucracy to try and tell them to do their job. Hit them in the pocket. Read the sources that you actually trust. We're coming up to the hour, so that pretty much wraps things up this week. But there's a few other stories that are worth searching out if you haven't already read about them this week. Bradley Manning has spoken for the first time since his arrest. He, of course, was the one that leaked evidence of US war crimes to WikiLeaks. There's lots of good blogs on the internet going into what he said. He talked about how he was effectively tortured and humiliated, and all of that under the nose of Nobel Peace Prize winner Barack Obama. Basically just the Black Bush times 10. Also this week, Palestine was upgraded by the UN to non-member status. Oh, how nice of them. The occupied Palestinians are now officially recognised as not mattering to the international community. They're now non-members. Ridiculous. And I don't know how many of you watch the Sons of Anarchy programme. One of the better dramas on TV these days, but the propaganda unfortunately still seeps through. And in the latest episode, I'm not sure when it airs, but I watched the last episode recently, and the biker gang, this Sons of Anarchy, basically illegally purchased weapons from Palestinians. Hamas was name dropped in there a few times. You know, it is what it is. I'll really get behind this show when they buy Israeli weapons from the Syrian rebels, but I won't hold my breath on that. Be sure to check out all the other great shows on flippingthepyramid.co.uk. But from me, Keelan Balderson, that about wraps things up. Here's a track from Adam Brown, a listener and supporter of the show, and his song Collateral Damage actually features samples from the show, so cheers to Adam for that. And here it is. Be sure to check out his page on SoundCloud even. I'll put the link in with the show when I post it online. Catch everyone next week.
Another child dies, oil changes hands. Are you sleeping tight? The blood is on your hands. There is more love than this. There is more love than this. There is more love than this inside. Mama, now the TV's on. They're using human rights to drop a few more bombs. Got another point of view, and it's for you. Tune into the resistance. It's on the radio. The new radio. www.freedomradio.co.uk. WideShut.co.uk. There is more love than this. There is more love than this. There is more love than this inside. What's really going on is oil. What's really going on is resources and big contracts, these military bases and strategic positions. It's the expansion of the new world order. So storm the gates and tell them no. 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 Another child dies. Oil changes hands. Are you sleeping tight? The blood is on our hands. And all these conflicts are always sold as human rights missions, talking about spreading democracy and saving the people from Gaddafi or Saddam or whoever. It all leads to the same thing, dead, innocent people. So we need to be careful not to fall back into the false paradigms that they give us on the media.